I would be appreciative of your prayers for me next Tuesday. I'll be having a surgery done on my wrist, hopefully to get rid of this pain I've been having. And the doctor assures me it's a minor surgery, very simple to do, but it's still on my wrist. So that's easy for him to say. The worst thing he said were the words local anesthetic, and I'd much rather be asleep while he's doing that, but that's not. Well, he has his own ideas. So you know how doctors are. Love you, Greg. All right. Yeah, that's what I think. I want a screen and headphones so I don't have to see it or hear anything. So I may just do that. Huh? Yeah, then Tracy wants to watch, so maybe. But anyhow, hopefully that'll be the end of my, or the beginning of the end of my pains I've been having. Tuesday morning. So we are in Matthew chapters 19 and 20 this evening, and hopefully as we go through these, we'll notice some interesting collections of stories and observations that are made, I think, and you know, some of the Gospels are arranged in a little different order, and each of the Gospel writers kind of arranges things in a way that that fits their overall goal in telling the story of Jesus' life. And so some of the things, I always wonder about kind of the chronology of some things as we go through the Gospels, and whether they're intended to be explicitly chronological, where one thing just follows after another like that, or sometimes things are grouped together. Tonight it feels like, or seems like, there's some things that are grouped together just because of some of the teaching or some of the comments that are made, as opposed maybe to these events just falling right on top of each other. And I don't know that I can back that up with a number line or a timeline or whatever, but just as I was reading through here yesterday and today, kind of made me feel like there's some things that fit together, and maybe that's just the way Jesus planned it out. You know, maybe they did fall right in a row chronologically, and it's just because that's the way Jesus wanted them to be. So, but I'll try to draw attention to those as we make it through the text. So we start off with some questions. And who's going to ask some questions of Jesus tonight? Those Pharisees. That's new. Another test. And why are they asking the questions? Because they want to test him. You know, you'd think they'd learn.
You know, it just struck me, this reminds me of the question that they asked. The way they ask it reminds me of what the serpent did to Eve, because they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?
Yeah.
It reminds me of what the serpent asked. Is it true that you can't eat from any tree of the garden? I mean, knowing what the answer is, really, just
Yeah.
being the way they are.
You know, that's kind of a very interesting comparison. I don't think I've ever read it that way, but when the serpent asked Eve, has God told you that you can eat of any tree in the garden? And he's putting that out there because he knows the answer, and he knows how she's going to respond, and that's going to lead to the temptation that he has in mind for her. And then it's almost worded very similarly here when the Pharisees come to Jesus. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all? And they do the Pharisees already know their position on this, by the way? They know what their teaching is. They know what their understanding of the law is. And so they are putting this out there to try to trip Jesus up. And it's one of those situations where, when they brought the woman who was taken in adultery and they placed her before Jesus and they asked the questions, they wanted Jesus to take a position because they were going to take the other position and try to play the crowds against Jesus, try to play the witnesses against him. And I think maybe there's something similar going on here where they present an issue that there's obviously been debate about through the ages, through the centuries. There's been debate about this, and it may not be settled theological matter for them. And so if Jesus takes a stand on it, then that puts them in a position to take a different position to try to place themselves, in the people's favor against Jesus, because Jesus had so much popularity with the people that they were constantly looking to undermine him. So the question they ask is, go ahead.
It is interesting that even though they asked him the question for the purpose of testing him, he gives him a chance to teach.
Yeah.
And there's a large crowd there.
Yeah.
A huge crowd.
That's exactly right.
So he's able to teach that crowd the right answer.
And one of the things that continually amazes the crowds that Jesus talks to is the way that he teaches and the authority with which he teaches. And so every time that Jesus gets the opportunity to teach is a good thing, because it just reinforces to the crowds who hear him who he is and the authority with which he teaches. So Jesus doesn't shy away from this challenge any more than he shies away from any other challenge that gets placed before him, which in and of itself is a good lesson for us, by the way, because is this an easy question? It's not an easy question. And if you haven't been impacted by this question with friends or family or loved ones, then you're in a unique position in our society today, because this question affects so many different people. And wow, so Jesus doesn't shy away from it, and I think there's a lesson there for us about not shying away from difficult questions, because those are going to come up, and those are the questions that really matter to people sometimes. And we need to be prepared with an answer, as Jesus was. So Jesus answers in verse 4. He says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently are there no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." So Jesus replies to them by going all the way back to creation and talking about God's intent for a husband-wife relationship from the very beginning. So what is God's intention for marriage from the very beginning? There'll be one flesh. And if God has joined it together, then let not man break it asunder. What God has established as being the proper relationship, it's not man's place to change that. And so God has placed his seal, if you will, or his expectation on what that marriage relationship is supposed to be, and to deviate from that is not what God had intended. And so how do the Pharisees reply? Okay, so why did Moses say it's okay to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Remember last week the scene that James and Peter and John saw with Jesus, and who was there with him? Moses and Elijah. And Peter's response was, let's build 3 tabernacles, and the voice from heaven came and said, this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him. And so in that moment, we have it established that who is the greater authority? Who is the greater teacher? It's Jesus. And it's interesting now that at this place, we're in an instant where the Pharisees are pitting Moses against Jesus. They think they're pitting Moses against Jesus. And in the Jewish way of thinking, who is the greatest teacher? Who is the greatest source of law that ever was? It was Moses. And so you don't ever challenge Moses. Remember, think about why Stephen was killed. Because they were stiff-necked and uncircumcised, and they were challenging, they were not fulfilling the law of Moses by looking to Christ. There was, you don't challenge Moses. And so when the Pharisees, this is their aha moment. This is the light bulb has gone off. Jesus has said, here's what God has taught about marriage. And they think they've got him cornered because you don't argue with Moses. And so how does Jesus reply? Yeah, because of your hardness of heart. Now, wait a minute. These guys weren't around back then. So whose hardness of heart is he talking about? Mankind, the children of Israel. And I mean, the hardness of heart continues that Moses dealt with continues until this day. The issues that Moses dealt with that were difficulties in the time of Moses are still difficulties today, is what Jesus is saying. So because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not this way. And so I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So Jesus doesn't back down from what they say. They want to pit Moses against Jesus, and Jesus says, you're pitting Moses against God. And Jesus is going to take God's side of the issue, of the argument, and say, this is the intent of the Creator from the beginning. Any deviation from that is not okay. And so Jesus puts that out there for them to hear.
I don't want to get off track.
Okay.
But, you know, as we reach out to people
Mm-hmm.
of the world, you know, we've been divorced several times, sometimes not always. You know, how do we explain this to people?
That's a great question.
Because they, up to, you know, up to the point where someone's reaching out to them with the gospel, they have no idea what's
Mhm.
going on.
You're right. And yet we are accountable to God's law, whether we know God's law or understand God's law or not. Because there is a word which will judge us in the last day, and that word is this. There's not one set of God's expectations for those who know him and another set for those who don't know him. God has one set of expectations. And what I don't advocate us becoming is arbiters of whose marriage is just and whose marriage is not. I'm not qualified for that job, and I don't think any of us are. All we can do is teach the truth. And so if we teach the truth that this is what God says about marriage, and you know, every man has to work out his own salvation with fear and trembling. And so I have to look at God's law, and I have to be willing to accept that God's law applies to me, or I have to reject that God's law applies to me and say, I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to have my own law when it comes to this. And so I have talked with people about this before, and all I can say is, you know, I've heard lots of explanations. I've heard lots of theories about why this doesn't mean what it appears to say. And after all of that has been said, I go back and I read it again, and it still says it. And so we could talk about why this doesn't mean what we think it means. I know you're not, but I mean, just with whatever situation, we could talk about all the reasons it doesn't mean what we think it means, but then we go back and read it, and it still says what it says. And we do that with lots of different Bible subjects, by the way. I've done the same thing with baptism, talking with people about baptism, and they're just convinced that baptism has no part in salvation. And then I go back and I read Acts 2:38, and it still says what it says. I go back and read Mark 16:16, and it still says what it says. And so all we can do is teach God's truth. And like I said at the beginning, just because it's a difficult truth doesn't mean we shy away from it or we ignore the subject, because Jesus doesn't shy away from this. He doesn't punt here. He doesn't take a mulligan on this. He dives right into it. And we understand that it's a difficult teaching based on the way his own disciples react to it. What do they say in the very next verse? Yeah. Jesus, if that's the way it is, we shouldn't get married at all. I mean, if that's God's expectation, that level of commitment, maybe it's better if we just all stay single. How do you feel about that?
shows you how the thinking was between men and women in marriage in that day.
Uh-huh.
They were afraid that if they made a commitment, they couldn't get out of it. You know, it was a different mindset.
Yeah. And
There was the same commitment to the church at that time. The church was also the bride. And
Yeah.
the commitment to the church, when they started worshiping idols and different things like that, that was adultery. That was going
Yeah.
against what you were committed to.
well, you're exactly right. And you think about the most graphic examples that God has in the Old Testament of his relationship with Israel in Hosea, telling him to marry a wife of prostitution, and then that being an example of God's relationship with Israel and how God, even in their unfaithfulness, remains faithful to them. And then in Ezekiel chapter, I think it's Ezekiel chapter 16 maybe, where God rescues them. At the beginning of the stories, he rescues them out of as a small child, but then as Israel blossoms, the imagery shifts to Israel becoming God's bride, and then she plays the harlot. And so it's very graphic examples of God's relationship with his people and the lengths to which he will go to stay committed to that relationship. And here, in the relationship that God has ordained from the very beginning of creation, that is supposed to be the closest relationship we have, the closest physical relationship we have with one another, with husband and wife. And even God, Jesus' own disciples are now stepping back from that commitment because they feel like it's too difficult of a teaching to bear. And so on the one hand, I don't think we as a church should or can shy away from what the Bible teaches about divorce and remarriage. But I think what we also should be doing is teaching from very early ages what that level of commitment is. And that, because society paints it as the idea, kind of what the Pharisees had, of there being this, come and go as you please relationship in marriage. That's not the way it is. And we need to be educating just all the time about the seriousness of that relationship. So the disciples asked Jesus this question, indicating how difficult of a teaching this is for them. It's a difficult teaching for us, but it's still God's teaching. And how does Jesus reply to their question? Not all men can accept this. Okay? So Jesus basically says, maybe it's best that some people don't get married. If that's what it takes to remain faithful to God, don't get married. Do we have any examples of that in the New Testament? Paul chose not to be married because to do so would take away from his commitment as he saw it to God. It would put him in a position where he had to worry about somebody else's welfare when what he wanted to be doing was out traveling and spreading the gospel. And so for him, that level of commitment to another human, to another individual, was not something that he was willing to follow through on because it would interfere with his commitment to God. And so I think Jesus here is saying his commitment is to God and to God's teaching. The Pharisees ask this question. He gives them God's teaching. They say, what about what Moses said? Jesus says, I'm going back to God and what his teaching is. And then they say, well, this is too hard for us to understand. And Jesus says, God is what matters. It's not our relationship with other people. Our relationship with other people have to be lived within the context of our relationship to God. And if our relationship with other people, whether it's a marriage relationship, whether it's a husband and wife, father-child, mother-child, friends, neighbors, whatever those relationships are, have to be lived within the context of our relationship to God, and all of those relationships are subordinated to our relationship with God. And so is it really that much more difficult than when he says, hate your mother and father? Than when he says, I will pit brothers against brothers, and sons against fathers. I mean, is this teaching really any more difficult than those things? When in the context we understand what he's saying in those contexts is put God first. And in this context, he's saying put God first. Isn't that it? So I understand it's personal, it's difficult from the standpoint of it's intensely personal, but it's still within that context.
I think it all boils down to how much you believe God and what he says.
Okay.
And so when he commands you to do something, it's not saying that it's going to be easy, but it's easier if you believe what he says. So if I was talking to someone, I would never bring up, if I knew they'd been divorced and they weren't a Christian, I would never bring up their divorce because they don't even believe in God, or they don't believe that his word is valid. So how am I making that valid? I would
Yeah.
introduce them to his love and who he is first, and make the word and his commandments true
Yeah.
to them before you ever approach it like that.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And the only way to, to accept this teaching, if it's a difficult teaching for us, the only way to accept the teaching is to have accepted God first and who he is and what his plan for us is and all of those things. And if we don't have that context, then this teaching to somebody who is outside of our fellowship, outside of our belief in the Bible, outside of our love for God, this teaching is insane. This teaching is crazy. But within the context of what we believe about God and the Bible, it's no different than what God calls us to on so many other levels, on so many other circumstances, to put him first in everything. It's the same call he gives us all the way through. On to happier topics. What happens next? Not that that's unhappy, but just something lighter. No, I'm skipping that one. Verse 13. That's in the context of the other passage. Jesus say, when he's talking about the eunuchs there, he says some are eunuchs by birth, some are eunuchs by choice, some are eunuchs for the kingdom of God. And what that means is a eunuch is one. You know what a eunuch is. I'm not going there, but some choose to live as a eunuch because they're going to put the kingdom of God first. And so if this teaching on marriage and divorce puts you in a position where you need to put God first, and what's the word I'm looking for? If you go decide not to engage in that relationship, then you have made that choice to live as a eunuch, and therefore put the kingdom of God first. And that's a totally reasonable lifestyle to choose. God is not calling us to too much there, if that's the lifestyle that we need to live in order to be pleasing to him. All right, so in the next section here, some children were brought to him so that he might lay hands on them and pray, and the disciples rebuked them. Silly disciples. Haven't they been around Jesus enough to know what Jesus is going to want to do here? Jesus loves children, and he wants to be around children, and they see children as a distraction, as a waste of time. Jesus is more important. He's got busier, more important things to do. And how does Jesus reply? Yeah, let them come to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. There's so much that we can learn from the way that children interact with Jesus. Their trust for him, their love for him, their desire to be around him. If a little kid trusts somebody, that may be an indication of that person is trustworthy. Because kids, if they're scared of somebody, maybe there's a reason. And kids were not scared of Jesus. So Jesus laid his hands on them and departed from there. Next comes a story that we're familiar with. The rich young ruler, or the rich young man, comes and asks Jesus a question. Yeah. What good thing shall I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus has an interesting statement there at the beginning. Why are you asking me about what is good? There's only one who is good. What is Jesus, why does Jesus go into this? This sounds like a rebuke, does it not? Yeah. I think I think Jesus understood the sincerity of the young man, first of all, and he understood where this conversation was going. I think this story in Luke, isn't it in the same story as the Pharisee, the same chapter as the Pharisee praying in the temple? I thank God that I'm not like, that guy over there, the sinner. And I think those two stories are together. And I think Luke 18, if I remember. But we have here a guy that's kind of like that Pharisee that's praying in the center of the temple. Does he know the law? Does this guy know the law? Yeah, he knows the law. And when Jesus replies with his list of things in the next verse, do not commit adultery, do not commit murder, shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness. Does he already know where he stacks up on those things? Yeah. Keep listing them, Jesus. I'm just knocking them out of the park here. You just keep serving them up, and I'm just going to keep hitting home runs. Because, I'm not doing any of those things. And everybody who knows me knows that. So just keep telling people how good I am. Okay, and so Jesus gets through this list, and all these things I have kept. What am I still lacking? See if you can name one that I don't hit out of the park here, Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Hit him where it hurt. Where in the law of Moses does it say sell all your possessions and give it to the poor? Does it say that anywhere? I mean, there are things about taking care of less fortunate. The law is definitely concerned about those things. But does the law, Jesus is listing 10 commandments, right? And he didn't list them all yet. And so the guy's thinking he's got a couple more he could list here that I'm doing pretty good on. And then Jesus goes not to the 10 commandments, but he goes to his heart. And now what?
Well, he's got I'm doing A, B, C, and D, and I'm going to work my way.
Yeah.
I've got those things down.
Yeah.
Well, he's really teaching that there's no salvation in the law.
Yeah. You're not going to earn your way in to the kingdom of heaven. And so you're exactly right. And he tells him where the real treasure is. Sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor and come follow me, and then you will have treasure in heaven. And he went away sorrowful because...
I think the key phrase there is follow me.
Yeah, and follow me. Come follow me.
Because so he gives away everything.
Yeah.
But if he doesn't have faith in Jesus that he's going to take care of it, he's going to be blessed because he's following him. It still doesn't do it.
So where was his faith? It was in his stuff. So, he was not putting his faith in Jesus or in God. He was putting his faith in his stuff. And the young man went away sorrowful, for he had a lot of stuff. He had much property. And so that's tough. That was a tough teaching. And so how do the disciples reply to that? Or Jesus says to his disciples then, truly I say to you, it is hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. How do the disciples respond to that? Yeah, then who can be saved? And remember at the beginning I said it seems to me like there's a couple of things here put together for a reason. How do the disciples respond when Jesus teaches them about marriage and divorce? It's impossible. Can't live that way, Jesus. And then Jesus has this exchange with this young man, and how do the disciples respond? It's impossible. We can't live that way, Jesus. And so it seems to me that they're being challenged here in some ways maybe that is designed to deepen their faith or deepen their understanding of who Jesus is in a practical sense, because Jesus is preparing them for what's coming next, which is the end. His death is coming very quickly. And so the disciples here are being challenged in some ways. Do we ever go through times like that? I think we do. And if we don't,
Well, if it's not a challenge, then we won't be refined.
Right. Yeah, I think we should. If we're not being challenged, if we look back on the last 10 years of our spiritual development, our spiritual lives, and we say, wow, everything's been pretty easy. Why is that? Why have we not been challenged? Jesus is preparing them for something that he knows is coming, and they're being challenged. And what happens as a result of them being challenged every step of the way here in this section? They're growing. They're learning to depend on him more. They're learning to rely on him more and listen to him more. And so it's these periods of being challenged when we have those moments. And if you've never had one of those moments where you think, I don't know if I can do that, God. I don't know if that's possible for me, God. What you're asking is too much, God. If you've never had one of those moments, I want to talk to you about that, because I've had those moments. But we learn from those. If we trust and we allow God to lead us through to the other side, then that's where the growth takes place. So, that's what's happening here. Chuck?
You know, every time along here, you know, when Jesus is teaching them, they're sitting there going, by man's standards, by our know, by what we know, what we've been taught, we can't do that.
Right.
And Jesus is telling them, you need to look beyond your abilities. You know, you need to look at God's abilities and trust that he can do these things. You know, because man, yeah, you're right. Man cannot
Right.
do these things, but not on his own. You know, but through God, you can.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's the position he is putting them in, so that they can understand that they can't do it on their own, that they have to rely on God's power. They have to rely on his teaching, on faith, in order for these things to be successful, because he knows what's coming. And the dark days are ahead. The very difficult times are ahead when he's going to be crucified, and they're going to be left sitting there wondering what just happened. And he needs them to make it through that time so that they can then proceed with the ministry that he has planned for them. And so, you know, Jesus understands that he's going to call them to do some things that right now they're not ready to do. And so he's bringing them along step by step so that they can be ready to do those things later. The chapter closes out here with Jesus, with Peter, and I think it fits right in with what we've just been talking about. When Peter says, "Behold, we have left everything and have followed you. What then will be there for us?" You know, Peter's kind of saying, Jesus, you're putting some difficult things before us, but can I remind you that we've already done some difficult things? Peter was a fisherman, wasn't he? How much fishing has he done lately? He went out and threw out a hook and caught the fish with the taxes in its mouth, but you know, he left the family business behind. James and John left the family business behind. Matthew was a tax collector. He left a lucrative business behind. They have left things behind. They have done difficult things to follow Jesus. And so, as you know, maybe there's a sense in this question of, how much harder can this get, Jesus? How much more are you going to ask of us? And is it wrong? Does it show a lack of faith on Peter's part for him to ask, what's in it for us? And I don't mean that to sound glib or like he's looking for something, but he basically is asking that question, isn't he?
Well, I think it's a sincere question, and
I think so.
I know, we've talked about this before, about questioning God in that way, but we want to be ready for the answer. You know?
Yeah.
And then we have to, when we're asking that question, we kind
Yeah.
of have to already know the answer,
Yeah.
in a way. And maybe then the answer will come on a
Yeah.
deeper level.
Well, think back to John the Baptist and his imprisonment, and he sent a delegation to Jesus to ask the question, you know, are you the one? Because John, I think, needed some reassurance, and Jesus said that John was the greatest man ever born up to that point, and he gives John the reassurance that he needs. And I don't think Peter is in any way wrong for asking this question, or is in any way showing a lack of faith. but he wants to be reassured. Jesus, you're asking us to do some very difficult things, or to accept some very difficult teaching, some very difficult ways to live here. And, you know, what's going to be the end of this? Is what you offer us in exchange for the things we're sacrificing now, is it going to be worth it for us? And Jesus replies, how? Yeah. Oh yeah, it's going to be worth it. And Jesus, this is not one of those times when Jesus could have come back and said, Peter, you're showing a complete lack of faith here. Peter, you're so wishy-washy, Peter. He doesn't go that route with Peter on this occasion. He gives Peter the reassurance that he needs. Because I think Peter, he knows Peter's heart, and he knows that Peter is willing to make those sacrifices and willing to give those things up and to do the hard things that need to be done. And it's okay to get that reassurance that it's all going to be worth it.
Kind of go back to today when we pray.
Mm-hmm.
And there's times when we pray, we're asking God, what do you want us to do next? Where do I go from here?
Yeah.
Give me some guidance. So it's not that you don't have trust in it, but you want to know what you need to do. And I think I don't think that there might be a little bit of a question of doubt, but I think he's thinking, what are we expected to do? I just don't know what you want us to do yet.
Yeah.
What is it? So, and that's, I think sometimes we as human, we tend to want clarification more than what we really need to get sometimes.
You know, we do like to have that neon sign pointing us in the direction we need to go, and sometimes that neon sign never shows up, and we just have to accept that, you know, that we're going the right direction, that God's going to make it okay the direction that we go if we just act on his behalf. But I think you're right, you know, and that I think Peter was just looking for clarification. He was looking for direction in the statement to know that it was going to be okay. You know, in kind of following the idea of themes, then I think with this final statement of chapter 19 here, many who are first will be last, and the last first. I think we shift a little bit into a new theme because we see that basically that same thing repeated in 2016, and then that thought is carried forth in verses 25 through 28 after some of the disciples ask a question. So we have these difficult teachings that lead some people to come to the conclusion that it's too hard, you know, through chapter 19, and then we shift to kind of a new theme for chapter 20 here. Chapter 20 begins with a parable about laborers in the vineyard. People are hired first thing in the morning, and they agree to a denarius, which is a day's wages. It was the standard day's wage for a day's worth of work in that age, and so they agree to go out and work in the man's vineyard for the day to receive that payment. And then the man goes back to the market. Let's see, he goes back several times. He goes at the third hour, so he would have gone at, first hour was 6 o'clock in the morning, right? 6 o'clock, and he went at the third hour, which was 9 o'clock. And then he went back at the 6th, which would have been noon, and the 9th hour, which would have been 3 in the afternoon, and the workday stopped at 6 p.m. And then he went out even at the 11th hour. So at 5 p.m., he goes out and finds people still idle in the marketplace, and he sends them all to the field. And with each one of the later groups, he just says, I will pay you what is right. I will pay you your wages at the end of the day, and he doesn't agree on a set amount. So at the end of the day, he begins paying people, and he begins with those who got there at the 11th hour, and he has his foreman pay them a full denarius. He pays them for a full day's labor. And so the people that were there all day are naturally thinking, what? We just got a raise, right? We're getting more money because he's paid, those guys were only here for an hour, and he paid them a full day's wages. We were here 12 hours. I wonder how much he's going to pay us. And he gets down to the end, and how much do they get paid?
What they agreed to.
What they agreed to, a denarius. And how did they walk away? They grumbled. They were mad. They were upset. Can you understand why? I can understand why. I mean, I can't say that I wouldn't have been a grumbler and a complainer too if I'd have been out there working all day long and got paid the same as a guy that just got there at 11. It doesn't seem fair, does it? And And how does Jesus respond? Verse, yeah. Yeah, verse 13, I did you no wrong. This is what we agreed to. This is righteous that I have paid you this amount. I've done exactly what I told you you'd do. You did exactly what you told me you would do. You said you'd work all day. You did. I said I'd pay you this much. I did. What's wrong? And so take what's yours and go your way. If I wish to give this last man the same as you, it's my business. It's lawful for me to do that. I've done nobody any injustice here. Okay, so what is the application here?
This is for those who from a very early age try to follow God the best they can. They work for God all their lives. And then you have those who are later on in their life that come to God, you know, and those that are the last moments before their death come to God. They all get the same reward.
Yeah.
There's a recent story up there in Pennsylvania, the congregation that we're helping to support. Not that long ago, there was a woman, a mother of 4 boys, who was baptized on Friday night. And Saturday night, as she was crossing the street after work, she was killed by a hit and run driver. So she got the same salvation that we're all looking forward to.
Yeah. And that's right. And I think there is a very personal, one person at a time application to this story where it's exactly that. We have somebody who becomes a Christian in their 80s, and they're at the end of their life. And are those of us who have been Christians for all of our lives going to begrudge them their salvation or feel like we should earn greater salvation or have greater reward just because we've served longer? That's ridiculous. You put it in that context, and who really would feel that way? And I don't want examples. But yeah, that just puts it in a whole different context, and it does. It puts it in a whole different context, and so yeah, I don't want names of people who might gripe about the salvation thing, but I think there's a personal application. I think there's also a broader application that can be made, and Jesus knows what the borders of his kingdom are going to be as that kingdom begins to spread. He tells them in Acts 1:8 that it's going to start in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and even to the uttermost parts of the earth. And so the gospel is going to spread to all nations, to all people. That's what Abraham was promised, that his seed would be a blessing to all mankind. And so Jesus understands that there are going to be people brought in, and how do some of the Jews react to that notion that Gentiles are going to be allowed into the kingdom? We'll let them in, but we don't like it. And as they come in, we're going to be the ones in charge because we've been here the longest, right? And we're going to be the ones that lay down the law and tell them what to do. And Jesus, I think, in some ways is giving us kind of this broad notion that his kingdom is going to have a little wider borders than maybe even his own disciples at that time thought about. And then, verse 16, how does that story end? First shall be last, and the last shall be first. And so this notion of setting up this hierarchy of who's going to be most important in the kingdom and who's going to have the greatest stature and who's going to be in charge and all that stuff, that's foreign to the kingdom of God. That's something that earthly, physical people think about. That's not something that spiritual people think about. That's not something that enters into spiritual kingdoms. And then Jesus enters into another moment with some difficulty here. He gets to the 12, takes them aside, and tells them what?
Who's going to be delivered to the chief priests and they'll condemn him to death.
Yeah. We're heading to Jerusalem, and when we get there, the Son of Man will be delivered, and they will condemn him to death, They will deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him. On the third day, he will be raised up. And they said, oh, okay. Sounds good. Sometimes, it's easy for us, I think, sometimes to be hard on people in the Bible. Sometimes it's like you go back and you read the things that the Israelites did. Come on, people, right? I mean, you just can't believe how stupid they were for treating God the way they did, or for making the decisions they did. And sometimes we look at the disciples, it's like, come on, guys, he's telling you exactly what he's going to do, and they still don't get it. They still don't fully understand what he's talking. He said they're going to kill him and they're going to raise him again on the third day. What do you think he meant? What do you think he's talking about, guys? Because I don't understand what he said. Yeah, is he talking in parables again? And so, it's easy for us, I think, with our understanding of the gospel to kind of look back, but think about where they were in the moment as this was being revealed to them piece by piece. This was new. The idea of the Messiah dying and then being raised again, that was completely foreign to their way of thinking. And so it's easy for us to be hard on them, but we have to put ourselves in their shoes. We can't put them in our shoes because they never got to live on this side of it. Well, not for as long, not for the context that we have. But what question is asked of Jesus next? Yeah. Who's taking over once you're gone? When you come in your kingdom, and who is it that asks him? Oh, Mom. Really? Do you think they put her up to it, or do you think she comes without them knowing that she's coming? I've always wondered. Yeah, she said, does she say, hey guys, come here, let's go talk to Jesus? Or do they know what she's about to ask? I'm just picturing, maybe it's because I work in a middle school, but I'm picturing like, middle schoolers don't want anything to do with their moms. And maybe they're, maybe it's the wrong context. I don't know. But I wonder about how this story develops, because we're just kind of dropped in the middle of it. And she asks, when you come in your kingdom, command that these two sons of mine may sit on your right and on your left. What is the significance of those things?
It's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
Jesus might be in charge, but they're going to be the number one, number two man.
Yeah. We heard the phrase, my right-hand man. I mean, he's the one that carries out, my will. He's the one that rules in my place if I'm not there, if I'm not available. And so they're asking for preferential treatment. And Jesus replies how? You have no idea what you're asking. Because they're still thinking in very physical terms. They're still not thinking about a spiritual kingdom. They have no idea what they're asking. And, are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? He's just told them what's about to happen, right?
If you go back to chapter 19, and there in verse 28, he's talking about, that Peter said they left everything to follow him and everything, but then he says, truly I say to you that you have followed me in the generation when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne. You also shall set upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Uh-huh.
And I think this may have been what they were thinking about. Okay, we're going to be, so I want to be on first seat.
Yeah.
To judge on the first throne,
Right.
I just wonder if that's what they were, what they were kind of thinking about whenever they came to Jesus and asked this.
That's possible. It could be that this has spurred that thinking, or made them then think in this direction, but it still reveals their physical thinking when Jesus is making an entirely spiritual comment about what he's going to do, at the regeneration when he sits at his glorious throne. When does Jesus take possession of his throne? It's not till after he ascends in Acts chapter 1 that Jesus then goes to sit on the throne that God has prepared for him. And so, Jesus is not talking about something physical. He's talking about something that's spiritual. And so this reveals their complete misunderstanding, which is why he says to them in chapter 20, verse 22, you don't know what you're asking. You're thinking in physical terms, and I'm speaking about things that are spiritual. So when they say that we are able to drink from this cup, he says, my cup you shall drink, but sit on my right hand and my left. This is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. And so Jesus receives his throne from the Father, and whatever other thrones there are to dole out, to hand out, those also belong to the Father. It is not Jesus' place to determine who's going to take those thrones or who's going to sit in those places of honor. So then, but with what follows in the next verses there, it fits right with this theme that we've seen at the end of chapter 19, and then in verse 16, the idea the first shall be last and the last first. Jesus says, further, the rulers of the Gentiles. Well, verse 24, how did the other disciples respond to this? Are they mad because they didn't think of it first? Or are they mad because I was going to ask that, but you beat me to it, Or are they mad because, what are you thinking, guys? You just made us all look bad. They're indignant with the two brothers. But Jesus calls them to himself, says, that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Sounds an awful lot like the first shall be last and the last shall be first, right? And so he's putting that in context one more time for them. Look what he's doing here. Within the context of him saying that we're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die and be raised again, he's delivering these difficult teachings to them that's stretching their faith. He's reiterating this teaching now 3 times to them that they need to be focused on spiritual things, and they need to be focused on humility and not be focused on establishing, who is the greatest. They need to be really establishing who is the greatest servant. And so, these themes that go through chapter 19 and 20 really are what struck me as I was preparing for class tonight. The chapter here ends with a story as they're walking out from Jericho and headed towards Jerusalem. Then a great multitude followed him. Behold, 2 blind men sitting by the road heard that Jesus was passing by, and they cry out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And the multitude sternly told them to be quiet, but they cried out the more, saying, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. And Jesus stopped, and I love Jesus' questions. What do you want me to do for you? Well, they're 2 blind guys, and they're calling out to you. What do you think they want you to do? But it wasn't for his purpose. He obviously knew what they were doing, but they needed to be able to say it. The crowd needed to hear what was going on, and this needed to play out this way so that the proper things could be done, and God would be glorified by the miracle that's going to take place. So they state what they wanted. We want our eyes to be open, and Jesus shows his compassion. He touches their eyes, and their sight was regained. So, and then they followed him. Yeah. And so, imagine, I've always thought of this, imagine you're blind, and we don't know, it doesn't really say if these were born blind, but imagine you're blind and your sight is restored, and the very first thing you see is the face of Jesus. And what a tremendous, just a tremendous thought that is. And then from a spiritual standpoint, we're lost in sin, we're saved, and the first, the thing that we're saved by is the sight of Jesus. So it's a good illustration for us. Well, thank you for your attention, and we'll pick it up next week with 21.